The night my life unraveled started just like any other Tuesday. Nothing seemed unusual as I walked through the door of my house after a long day at work. My wife, Jenny, was in the kitchen, humming along to some pop song as she stirred a pot on the stove. She looked up and flashed me that familiar smile, the one that used to make me feel like I'd won the lottery. But lately, something was off. Maybe it was the way she avoided my eyes as I came in, or how she seemed to always be on her phone, laughing at something she never shared. It felt like I was standing on the outside, staring in at a life that was mine but somehow wasn't. As I washed up for dinner, I told myself it was just stress. Things at work had been rough, and I hadn't exactly been the most present husband lately. But tonight, a small, nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach refused to go away. "Hey, how was your day?" Jenny asked over her shoulder, not bothering to look at me. I shrugged, grabbing a towel. "Same as always. Long. What about you?" She turned, a little too quickly, and busied herself with setting plates on the table. "Oh, you know. Nothing special." Her voice sounded just a bit too rehearsed. After dinner, as she cleared the table, her phone vibrated on the counter. I glanced at it, noticing the message preview light up her screen. "Can't wait to see you again." I froze. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Jenny quickly picked up her phone, sliding it into her pocket with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, just Amber. She's going through a breakup, so I've been talking her through it." I nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling twisting in my gut. But something wasn't right. I'd known Jenny for 10 years, and I could tell when she was lying. But what was I supposed to say? Accuse her of cheating because of a text? I pushed the thought down, telling myself I was being paranoid. Over the next few days, that feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew, like a storm gathering in the distance, and every time her phone buzzed, I felt a bit more of myself slipping away. That Friday, I made a decision. After Jenny went to bed, I crept into the living room, opened her phone. She'd fallen asleep without locking it. I scrolled through her messages, heart pounding, breath shallow. And there it was, a name I didn't recognize, Matt. A thread of texts, plans, dinners, laughing emojis. I had such a good time. And worst of all, I miss you. I stared at the screen, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. My whole world shattered right there, in the dim light of our living room, in front of the phone that held the truth of her betrayal. My hands shook as I closed the phone and sat back, stunned, unable to believe what I'd just seen. The woman I'd loved, trusted, spent a decade building a life with, had been lying to me. And if that wasn't enough, I found myself feeling something darker, something I couldn't ignore. I needed to know everything. I needed to see how far this betrayal went, and how long she thought she could keep fooling me. I put her phone back and went to bed, lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, knowing everything was about to change. And that was just the beginning. The next morning, I felt like a ghost moving through my own life. Jenny's laughter at breakfast sounded hollow, like a cheap recording. I forced myself to smile, nodding at whatever she said, though I wasn't even listening. My mind was on those texts from Matt. Every word, every emoji felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I had to figure out who this guy was. After Jenny left for work, I sat in the kitchen, staring at my cold coffee, trying to make sense of it. She'd taken our car, so I decided to check her usual spots. I'd seen her location on Google Maps a million times. She worked at an office downtown, close to the coffee shop where she often went after work with friends. But if Matt was meeting her somewhere, I needed to find it. I went to our shared computer and logged into her Gmail, something I hadn't done in years. Luckily, her password was the same old combination of our anniversary and her lucky number. She'd been careless, maybe too comfortable in her web of lies. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. In her Google Maps history, I saw a new pattern, a detour she'd been making a few times a week, stopping at an address that wasn't anywhere near her office or the coffee shop. I copied it down, feeling the anger and adrenaline building up, pushing me to act on the betrayal that was unfolding. I wanted to confront her right then, but something told me I wasn't ready. I didn't have enough. I needed to see this with my own eyes. So I waited. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to her routine, acting like everything was normal while I observed every little detail. On Wednesday, Jenny told me she had a late meeting and would be home after 9. This was my chance. As soon as she left, I grabbed my car keys and followed her at a safe distance, careful to stay out of sight. Her route was straight toward that address I'd found. I parked half a block away, watching as she got out and walked toward a small, nondescript house. She moved quickly, glancing around as if worried someone would see her. My heart pounded, and I felt a sick wave of dread, knowing that the worst was about to be confirmed. As she approached the house, a man stepped out onto the porch. He looked a little older than me, with an easy smile and a familiarity that made my stomach turn. Jenny practically ran up the steps, throwing her arms around him in a way that was too comfortable, too intimate. It was him. Matt. I watched, hidden in my car, as they went inside, the door closing behind them. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at that closed door, wondering how long this had been going on. How long she'd been lying to me while playing the perfect wife. I took out my phone and snapped a picture of the house, of her car parked outside, of everything I could. Proof. I needed to build a case. I didn't know for what yet, but I knew I couldn't confront her without undeniable evidence. Not yet. I waited until her car finally pulled out of the driveway, a couple of hours later. I followed her home, keeping my distance, adrenaline thrumming through my veins. By the time she walked through our front door, she was back to her normal, cheerful self, acting as if she hadn't just spent the evening wrapped up in another man's arms. "Hey, honey," she greeted me, kissing me on the cheek. "Sorry I'm late. The meeting ran longer than I thought." I forced a smile, pushing down the rage that burned inside. "No problem," I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the emotions that threatened to spill over. But inside, I knew this was only the beginning. If she thought she could keep this a secret, she had no idea what I was capable of. And with each passing day, I became more certain I wasn't just going to catch her. I was going to make her regret every single lie she'd ever told me. The next few days felt like a dark, surreal play where I was both the audience and the lead. Every time I looked at Jenny, I saw her with him, with Matt, laughing and lying and pretending as if nothing was wrong. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. But I wasn't just going to sit back and let this unfold. I started preparing, meticulously gathering every detail that could tie her to him. I set up a small camera in the living room, one of those discreet nanny cams, hidden behind a family photo on the shelf. If she brought him into our home, I wanted it all on record. Over the next few weeks, I became an expert in surveillance. I'd set up GPS tracking on her car, checking her location whenever she claimed to be at a meeting. The pattern was the same every time. She'd leave, take the detour to Matt's house, spend a few hours there, then come back home and act like the devoted wife. It was during one of those stakeouts that I got the confirmation I dreaded. One evening, she told me she was going out with her friends for a girls' night. She gave me a quick peck on the cheek, grabbed her purse, and breezed out the door. I waited a few minutes before following her, keeping far enough behind to go unnoticed. As I drove, my phone pinged with an alert from the GPS tracker I'd installed in her car. She was on the way to Matt's house. I clenched the steering wheel, my pulse racing. I'd been preparing for this, but the thought of actually catching them felt like acid in my veins. When I reached his neighborhood, I parked a few houses down, hidden by shadows. I saw Jenny's car in his driveway, parked close enough to the house that it would be out of sight from the road. She was cautious, I'd give her that. But not cautious enough. I slipped out of my car and moved quietly, staying close to the fence line as I approached the house. I knew it was a risk, but I needed more than just a hunch. I needed irrefutable proof that she was with him. I crept up to a side window, crouching low to avoid being seen, and peered inside. There they were. In the dim light, I saw Jenny and Matt on the couch, wrapped in each other's arms, oblivious to everything around them. She was laughing, her head thrown back, and he was leaning in, his hand resting on her knee. They looked like they'd been doing this for years, comfortable, relaxed, like they didn't have a care in the world. I pulled out my phone, snapping picture after picture, each one adding to the sickening weight of betrayal pressing down on me. As I watched them, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just an affair. It was more. The way they looked at each other, the way she laughed with him in a way I hadn't seen in years, it was a relationship. She wasn't just sneaking around. She was living a double life. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stumbled back to my car, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, each one darker than the last. I couldn't believe how blind I'd been. How she'd lied to my face every single day, all while building a life with someone else. That night, when Jenny came home, I didn't even look at her. She came into the bedroom, already dressed in her pajamas, smiling like she hadn't a single care in the world. She crawled into bed beside me, snuggling up to my side, and whispered, "Tonight was so much fun. It's so nice to catch up with the girls." I clenched my fists under the covers, every nerve in my body screaming at me to confront her, to throw all the evidence in her face and demand an explanation. But I held back. If I confronted her now, she'd just deny it, twist it somehow, make herself out to be the victim. No. This was going to be on my terms. "Glad you had a good time," I replied, my voice as calm as I could make it. She sighed contentedly, and within minutes she was asleep. But I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every fiber of my being consumed with thoughts of revenge. I wasn't going to let this go. She was going to feel every ounce of betrayal that she'd put me through. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to take this further, to a place she'd never see coming. By the next day, a new kind of determination had settled over me. I'd been crushed, humiliated, kept in the dark like a fool. But that was over now. I wasn't going to be the quiet, obedient husband she'd come to expect. No, this time, I was going to turn her betrayal back on her in ways she'd never anticipate. The first step in my plan was simple: act completely normal. I'd become so good at hiding my rage that Jenny had no clue anything was off. I smiled when she smiled, laughed when she laughed. I even started making small gestures to keep her guessing, like bringing her flowers or making dinner reservations. Each time, she'd flash me a surprised, almost guilty look, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. Did I suspect something? Or was I genuinely just being thoughtful? I wanted her to think I was clueless, that I was falling further into the oblivious role she'd carved out for me. But every time she turned away, I could feel my anger rising, reminding me why I was doing this. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, I decided to plant the first seed of my plan. "Hey," I started casually, cutting into my steak. "I was thinking we should get away for a weekend. You know, just us. Maybe go up to the cabin?" Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She looked at me, her face unreadable for a split second before she smiled. "Really? You want to go to the cabin?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a grin. "It's been ages since we went up there. Figured it'd be nice to have some time alone." She hesitated, glancing down at her plate. "I'll have to check my calendar at work, but that sounds wonderful." I watched her closely, noting the flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, maybe? Fear? Either way, it was exactly what I'd wanted. I needed her to agree to a weekend away with me, to commit to something that would force her to play her role as the devoted wife in front of everyone. And judging by her reaction, she was still torn between her lies and the need to keep up appearances. The next day, I made another move, reaching out to an old friend of mine, Dave. We'd gone to college together, and he worked as a private investigator now. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Dave, it's been a while." I greeted him over the phone, forcing a casual tone. "Yeah, man. What's up?" he replied, his voice warm, though clearly surprised to hear from me. "I need a favor. A big one." I took a breath. "I need you to follow my wife." There was a pause, then a soft sigh on the other end. I was hoping this was just a catch-up call. All right, what's going on? I filled him in, explaining the affair, the lies, the whole sordid story. By the time I finished, my throat was dry, my hands clenched around the phone. Dave listened quietly, not interrupting once, and when I was done, he didn't ask any questions. He simply agreed, saying he'd get started right away. For the next few days, I waited for updates. During that time, Jenny was her usual self, occasionally claiming to go out with friends, or for a work dinner. I tracked her location each time, watching as she followed the same route to Matt's house. It was all painfully predictable, like a sick routine she thought she was keeping hidden. Then, a week later, I got the call. "You're not gonna like this," Dave said, his voice low. "But I followed her last night. She met him, all right, and they weren't exactly discreet about it. I've got everything on camera, photos, videos. It's as clear as day." I closed my eyes, my chest tightening. Even though I'd prepared myself, hearing it from someone else made it real in a way I hadn't expected. I was quiet for a moment, trying to find the right words. "Thanks, Dave," I managed. "I needed this. I figured. Listen, if there's anything else you need, let me know. And I'm sorry, man. I really am." After we hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the evidence in my hands. She'd thought she could lie to my face, that I'd never find out. But now I had every piece I needed. And it was time to put the next part of my plan into motion. The following weekend, I casually mentioned to Jenny that I'd been talking to Dave. Her face lit up. She remembered him from college and had always liked him. I suggested that we invite him and a few other friends up to the cabin for a weekend, make it a fun group trip. Jenny hesitated, clearly torn. But with a bit of prodding, she agreed, and the plan was set. If she thought I was going to let her get away with this, she was in for a rude awakening. The weekend at the cabin would be her downfall. The weekend trip to the cabin was set. Jenny seemed slightly nervous, but I played my part so well that she must have believed she'd gotten away with everything. She even packed the car with snacks and a couple of bottles of wine, like it was going to be some happy reunion with old friends. As we drove up, she chattered on about how excited she was to see everyone, occasionally glancing at me as if to gauge whether I suspected anything. I kept my smile steady, nodding along, acting every bit the clueless husband. When we arrived, Dave was already there, leaning against his car with that knowing smirk he always wore. Jenny greeted him with a friendly hug, and I noticed a brief flicker of unease in her eyes as he gave me a nod, like we shared some unspoken understanding. He didn't let on that he knew about her betrayal, keeping his demeanor light and casual, just another friend here for a good time. As evening settled in, our small group gathered around the fire pit outside, sharing stories from our college days and reminiscing about the good old times. Jenny laughed along, sipping her wine, her guard completely down. She didn't notice that I was barely drinking, or that Dave and I exchanged glances more often than old friends usually would. Finally, after hours of meaningless chatter, Dave leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. "So, Jenny, how's everything been going? Life treating you well?" She looked a little caught off guard by the sudden change in tone but nodded. "Yeah, everything's been great. Really great," she replied, her smile tightening just a bit. "Good to hear," he said, then glanced at me. "Because, you've got a hell of a husband here. Most people would kill to have someone as loyal as he is." Jenny froze for a moment, clearly unsure where this was going. She laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Of course. I know that. We've got a great relationship." I leaned back, watching her closely, letting the tension simmer in the air. I could see her unease growing, like she was finally sensing that something wasn't right. She glanced over at me, her smile fading. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, nothing," I said, my tone cold. "I just think it's interesting how some people take loyalty for granted. How they assume they can lie and cheat without consequences." Her face went pale, and she looked like she'd just been slapped. What What are you talking about? Dave didn't miss a beat. Come on, Jenny, he said, his voice sharp. We know. You can stop pretending. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips. I could see the guilt flashing in her eyes, her mind scrambling to come up with a response. She turned to me, reaching out, but I leaned away, refusing to let her touch me. I know everything, Jenny, I said, my voice low and steady. I know about Matt. I know about the lies. And I know you've been playing me for a fool this whole time. For a moment, she just stared at me, her face crumbling. I could see the realization dawning on her, the slow, agonizing understanding that her double life was over. Ryan, please, it's not what you think, she stammered, her voice shaking. I can explain. I laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. Oh, you're going to explain? Really? Because I'd love to hear how you're going to talk your way out of this. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked around desperately, like she was searching for some escape. But there was none. Dave sat there, arms crossed, watching her with a mix of disappointment and disgust. I trusted you, I continued, my voice growing colder. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me? Ryan, please, she begged, her voice cracking. It was a mistake. I never meant for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. I shook my head, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. A mistake? You call months of lying and sneaking around a mistake? She was sobbing now, completely breaking down, pleading with me to understand. But there was nothing left to understand. I'd seen the truth with my own eyes. I'd felt the betrayal in every lie, every deceitful smile she'd given me over the past few months. I gave you everything, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. And you threw it all away. Dave stood up, putting a hand on my shoulder. You don't have to do this, man, he said quietly. She's not worth it. But I wasn't finished. I needed her to understand just how deeply she'd cut me, just how much she'd destroyed. So, I pulled out my phone and played the recordings I'd taken, pictures of her at Matt's house, the videos of them together. I watched as her face went from horror to disbelief, her sobs turning into gasps as the reality of what she'd done hit her all over again. Ryan, please, I can change. I can make this right, she choked out, reaching for me. But there was nothing left to save. I'd seen the truth, and it had shattered everything we'd built together. I'm done, Jenny, I said, standing up. I'll be filing for divorce. And I hope you and Matt are very happy together, if he even wants you after this. With that, I walked away, leaving her sobbing by the fire, broken and exposed. She had destroyed our life, but I was finally free from her lies. As I walked away from the fire that night, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I'd confronted her, let her see the devastation she'd caused, and now I was done. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. The divorce would be messy, and I still had a lot to figure out. But for the first time in months, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. Back at the cabin, I tried to sleep, but my mind kept racing. I couldn't shake the image of Jenny's face, the way it crumpled as she realized her lies had finally caught up with her. Part of me felt some grim satisfaction, but another part, the part that still remembered the life we'd built together, felt hollow, like I'd lost something I could never get back. The next morning, I woke up to find Dave already packing his things. He looked at me, eyebrows raised in question. So, what's the plan now? I shrugged, rubbing my temples. Honestly? I have no idea. I need time to figure this out. Well, whatever you decide, just remember that you're not alone in this, he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. I know this isn't easy, but you've done the right thing. I nodded, grateful for his support. As we finished packing up, I noticed Jenny standing by the fire pit, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't slept, and the dark circles under her eyes made her look like a ghost of the woman I'd married. She tried to approach me, but I avoided her gaze, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a conversation. There was nothing left to say. The drive back home was painfully quiet. Jenny didn't speak, and I kept my eyes on the road, forcing myself not to look at her. I could feel her glancing at me, maybe hoping I'd say something, but I kept my mouth shut. If she was expecting sympathy, she was going to be disappointed. When we got home, I grabbed my bags and headed straight to the guest bedroom. I wasn't about to spend another night in the same bed as her. She hovered by the door, wringing her hands, as if she wanted to say something, but I slammed the door in her face, making it clear that I wanted nothing to do with her. The next few days were surreal. We barely spoke, only exchanging words when absolutely necessary. I started looking for lawyers, making calls when she wasn't around, trying to find someone who could help me untangle this mess as quickly as possible. But despite everything, there was still one loose end that bothered me, Matt. He'd destroyed my marriage, humiliated me, and I couldn't shake the need to confront him. He'd gotten off scot-free, while I was left to pick up the pieces of my life. The thought of him living his life as if nothing had happened made my blood boil. One night, I decided I'd had enough. I needed answers, closure, something to help me make sense of everything. I grabbed my keys and drove over to Matt's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I was going to say, but I knew I had to see him face to face. When I arrived, I saw his car in the driveway, confirming he was home. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding, and walked up to the front door. After a moment's hesitation, I rang the doorbell, listening as footsteps approached. The door swung open, and there he was, standing in front of me with a look of surprise on his face. He seemed to recognize me instantly, his expression shifting from surprise to guilt in a matter of seconds. "Ryan," he said, his voice uneasy. What are you doing here?" I stared at him, my jaw clenched. "I think you know exactly why I'm here, Matt." He swallowed, looking down at his feet. "Look, man. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "Really?" I shot back, my voice laced with bitterness. "Because from where I'm standing, you didn't care about anyone but yourself." He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. "You took my wife, Matt. You lied to my face, you betrayed me, and you destroyed my marriage. And now you want to stand there and say you never meant for it to happen?" His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked genuinely remorseful. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I'm sorry. I messed up. I let things get out of control, and I hate myself for it." I could see the regret in his eyes, but it didn't make me feel any better. It didn't undo the months of lies, the nights I'd spent wondering where Jenny was, the betrayal that had torn my life apart. "I trusted you," I said quietly. "I thought you were my friend." He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I never wanted it to go this far. I tried to end things, but she kept coming back. She kept saying she loved me, that she was going to leave you. I didn't know what to believe anymore." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. So, it wasn't just a fling. She told him she loved him, that she was planning to leave me for him. I felt like I'd been stabbed all over again, the wound reopened with a new kind of pain. "So what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You thought you could just take her, ruin everything we had, and walk away without a scratch?" He looked back at me, his face filled with shame. "I know I can't make it right, Ryan. I know that. But I'll do whatever I can to make this easier for you. I'll stay out of your life, stay away from her, whatever you need." But his words felt hollow. He could apologize all he wanted, but it didn't change what he'd done. He'd destroyed my life, and now he was standing there, acting like he could just disappear and make it all go away. I stared at him, the anger and betrayal swirling inside me, but I knew that lashing out wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't erase the pain or bring back the trust that had been shattered. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the doorway, his face etched with guilt and regret. As I got back in my car, I realized that I didn't need closure from him. I didn't need his apologies or his guilt. I needed to let go of the past, to move forward without letting his betrayal define me. That night, as I drove home, I made a decision. I was done with both of them, Jenny and Matt. They could have each other, for all I cared. But I was going to take back my life, rebuild what they tried to tear down, and come out stronger on the other side. The next morning, I called the lawyer and told him I wanted to file for divorce immediately. There was no going back now. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I'd finally be free from the lies and betrayal that had haunted me for so long. Filing for divorce felt like ripping off a bandage I'd been holding onto for too long. When I met with my lawyer, he reviewed everything I'd brought: photos, messages, recordings. He barely looked up from his desk as he took notes, his expression as professional as ever. But as I watched him scribble, a sense of finality hit me. There would be no reconciliation, no way to undo the damage Jenny had caused. I went home that night with mixed feelings, a strange emptiness settling over me as I walked through the front door. Jenny was in the kitchen, making tea, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But the thought vanished as soon as she turned and saw me, her expression immediately shifting to one of guilt and worry. "Ryan," she started, her voice hesitant. I wanted to talk. Please, let's just sit down. Can we talk about this?" I took a breath, fighting the urge to shout, to ask her how she could have lied to my face for so long. But I kept my tone calm and steady. "There's nothing left to talk about, Jenny. I filed for divorce." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Her face fell, and for a moment she looked genuinely devastated, her eyes filling with tears. "Please, please don't do this. I know I messed up, but I love you, Ryan. I want to fix this." "Love me?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "You were ready to leave me for him, Jenny. Don't stand there and tell me you love me when you've been lying to me for months." She covered her mouth, stifling a sob. "I didn't know what I was doing. I was confused. I thought he understood me, but it was a mistake, Ryan. I know that now." I wanted to believe her. A small part of me, a part that still held on to memories of the life we built together, wanted to think that maybe, somehow, this was all just a horrible mistake. But I knew better. I'd seen the messages, heard her confessions through Matt's half-hearted apology. She'd been ready to leave me, she just hadn't expected me to catch her first. "It's too late for apologies," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm done, Jenny. You and Matt, you can have each other." She shook her head, desperation in her eyes. "Please, Ryan, don't throw this away. We can go to counseling, try to fix things. I'll do anything to make this right." But I couldn't do it. The trust, the bond we once had, it was shattered beyond repair. I took a step back, putting a physical distance between us. "I don't want your apologies, Jenny. I don't want anything from you. The papers are filed, and I'm moving on." She broke down, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But I knew that wasn't my role anymore. She'd made her choice, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. I walked past her, heading toward the guest room. She stayed in the kitchen, her cries echoing through the house. It should have made me feel something, anger, sadness, anything. But all I felt was a hollow emptiness, a numbness that came from knowing there was no going back. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Jenny tried to reach out a few times, leaving notes around the house, pleading for a chance to make things right. But I ignored her, focusing on the divorce and planning my next steps. I'd already started looking for an apartment, something small where I could rebuild, start fresh. One night, I came home to find her waiting for me, standing by the door with a letter in her hand. She looked more fragile than I'd ever seen her, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling slightly. "Ryan, please, just read this," she whispered, holding out the letter. I hesitated, wanting to brush past her, but something in her expression stopped me. I took the letter, unfolding it carefully, and began to read. It was a confession, her version of the story. She explained how she'd felt lost, how the routine of our marriage had left her feeling disconnected, and how she'd been drawn to Matt because he made her feel alive, again. She admitted to everything, describing her regret and her guilt in painstaking detail. The words blurred together as I read, each line feeling like another dagger twisting in my chest. When I finished, I looked up at her, my jaw tight. "So, you felt alive, and that justified betraying me?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Ryan, it doesn't justify anything. I was selfish, and I hurt you. I know that. But I want you to know that it wasn't because I didn't love you. I made a horrible mistake." Her words rang hollow. I couldn't feel anything but the overwhelming betrayal, the knowledge that the woman I'd loved, the woman I trusted with my life, had thrown it all away for a fleeting thrill. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "A mistake you made over and over for months." She didn't respond, just stood there, broken and defeated. I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't feel anything at all. "I'll be out of here soon," I said quietly, folding the letter and setting it on the table. "You don't need to keep trying to justify what you did. It's over." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of closure. She tried to explain, tried to make me understand her reasons, but it didn't matter. Nothing she said could undo the damage she'd caused. As I packed my things that night, I knew I was finally free. The life I'd built with her was gone, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to face it without her. A week later, I'd moved into my new apartment. It wasn't much, a small one-bedroom on the other side of town, but it was mine. I could finally breathe without the constant reminder of Jenny's betrayal lurking around every corner. It was strange, settling into a new space, but it felt like a clean slate. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to focus on the future rather than the painful mess I'd left behind. At first, the quiet was deafening. I'd lie awake at night, haunted by memories of our life together, the laughter, the plans we'd made, the love I thought we shared. But each day, it hurt a little less. The ache dulled, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve to rebuild my life from the ground up. One evening, as I was unpacking a box of books, my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting another message from a family member or friend checking in on me, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw the name on the screen, Jenny. I stared at it, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let her words drift into the void. But curiosity got the better of me, and I answered, holding the phone to my ear without saying a word. "Ryan." Her voice was quiet, hesitant. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to call." I kept silent, waiting for her to continue, feeling the anger I'd tried to bury start to rise again. I saw Matt today," she finally admitted, her voice trembling. "He wanted to talk." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice steady. "And?" She took a shaky breath. "I ended things with him, Ryan. I told him that I never want to see him again." A bitter laugh escaped me. "I'm supposed to care about that. You should have ended it months ago, Jenny. That would have mattered." "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know it's too late. I thought you'd want to know." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "Why now, Jenny? Why suddenly decide that he's not what you want?" She hesitated, her silence telling me everything I needed to know. "Because I realized he wasn't worth losing you over," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know that doesn't change anything, but it's the truth. I was so wrong, and I hate myself for it." The apology didn't move me. She'd already done the damage, and there was no way to repair it. "I've moved on, Jenny," I said, my tone flat. "Whatever you're going through now, that's on you." Her silence lingered, stretching out like a bridge between us that had long since crumbled. "I understand," she finally whispered. "I'm sorry, Ryan. For everything." I didn't respond, ending the call without another word. I stood there, staring at the phone, my mind racing. The strange thing was, I didn't feel anything. No anger, no satisfaction, not even sadness. She'd made her bed, and now she was lying in it alone. I'd given her everything, and she'd thrown it away. If she wanted forgiveness, she'd have to find it somewhere else. Over the next few weeks, I focused on myself. I started going to the gym, taking up hobbies I'd always been too busy for, anything to keep my mind occupied and my thoughts away from the past. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, finding comfort in the familiar laughter and easy camaraderie. Each day felt like a small victory, another step away from the life I'd left behind. Then one day, as I was out grabbing coffee, I bumped into Dave. He was in line ahead of me, and when he turned around and saw me, his face lit up with a smile. "Ryan! How's it going, man?" I shrugged, returning the smile. "Better than I thought, honestly. Starting to feel normal again." "That's what I like to hear," he said, clapping me on the back. "You deserve a fresh start." We ended up sitting together, talking about everything except Jenny and the divorce. It felt good, like I was finally finding pieces of myself that I thought were lost forever. As we talked, I realized that the anger, the bitterness, they'd started to fade. I was no longer defined by what Jenny had done. I was my own person again, stronger than I'd been before. After we finished our coffee, Dave leaned back, studying me with a grin. "You know, Ryan, I never thought I'd say this, but you're handling this better than most people would. I mean, after what you did." "I had to move on," I interrupted, smiling. "Otherwise, I'd have been stuck there forever." He nodded, raising his cup in a mock toast. "Here's to new beginnings, then." I clinked my cup with his, feeling a surge of gratitude for the friends who'd supported me through the darkest days of my life. I was free now, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of something good waiting for me on the other side of this mess. As I walked back to my apartment that day, I realized that I didn't need revenge, or closure, or even forgiveness. All I needed was a new path, a way to rebuild and find happiness again. And as I looked out at the city, the sun setting in the distance, I knew that I was ready to leave the past behind, to start a new chapter in my life, one that was mine, and mine alone. Weeks went by, and life began to settle into a comfortable rhythm. I was building a new routine, slowly letting go of the memories that once haunted me. I'd filled my apartment with books, plants, and things that felt like they belonged to me, pieces of a life untainted by Jenny's betrayal. One evening, I was sitting at my desk, paying bills and scrolling through emails, when a message appeared in my inbox. The subject line made my stomach clench, from Jenny. I almost deleted it without reading it, but something compelled me to open it. She hadn't reached out in a while, and my curiosity got the better of me. The message was short and uncharacteristically blunt. "Ryan, I know you're ready to move on, and I respect that. But there's something you need to know, something I've kept to myself for too long. It's about Matt. If you consider meeting me just one more time, I think you'll want to hear this. I promise I'm not asking for forgiveness, just closure for us both. Jenny." I stared at the screen, a dozen emotions swirling inside me. I'd told myself I was done with her lies, her excuses, and yet here I was, reading her email and wondering what she could possibly say that would make a difference. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete it, and close that chapter forever. But something gnawed at me, a feeling that maybe there was more to the story. After a few minutes of internal debate, I replied with a simple, "Fine. Tomorrow. Usual coffee place. 6 p.m. The next day, I arrived early, finding a quiet booth in the back where I could watch the door. I'd prepared myself for whatever excuses or explanations she tried to throw at me. But as she walked in, I noticed something different. She looked tired, almost hollow, like she'd aged years in the short time since I'd last seen her. She spotted me and approached with a weak smile, sitting down across from me without meeting my eyes. "Thanks for meeting me," she murmured, clutching her coffee cup like it was the only thing anchoring her. "Get to the point, Jenny," I said, keeping my tone flat. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't even know where to start, but you deserve the truth. The whole truth." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. So, what is it? Why'd you do it? She looked down at her coffee, her voice barely a whisper. Matt wasn't just some guy I met. He was looking for something, someone vulnerable, someone he could manipulate. And I was too stupid to see it until it was too late. I frowned, not sure if this was just another attempt to rewrite the story. What are you talking about? Ryan, he'd done this before, she said, her hands shaking. I didn't know at first, but he'd gotten involved with other women, married women. It was like a game to him. He manipulated me, made me feel like I needed him, like he understood me in a way you couldn't. So now you're saying he forced you into it? I shot back, incredulous. No. She winced, her eyes watering. No, that's not what I'm saying. I made my choices, and I know I betrayed you. I'm not excusing any of it. But he preyed on that weakness. He fed my insecurities, made me think you didn't care, that I was just an afterthought to you. The anger simmered beneath the surface, but I forced myself to listen. And you believed him? She nodded, looking ashamed. He said all the right things, made me feel special. But by the time I realized what he was doing, it was too late. He wasn't what I thought. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The rage and betrayal were still there, but now there was something else, an understanding, or maybe just a sickening realization that I hadn't been the only victim in this twisted game. So why are you telling me this now? I asked, my voice cold. Her eyes filled with tears. Because you need to know. You need to know that it wasn't just you I hurt. I let someone manipulate me, ruin everything I cared about, and I don't want to carry that alone. I wanted to give you the truth, to own up to everything. You deserve that much. I studied her, searching for any sign of deception, but all I saw was regret, a deep, aching regret that went beyond words. I didn't know if I believed everything she'd said, but one thing was clear, she'd fallen into a trap of her own making, and now she was paying the price. Jenny, I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I'm done with this. With all of it. I've got to move on. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I understand. And I'm sorry, Ryan. For everything. With that, she stood, giving me one last, long look before she walked out of the coffee shop, disappearing into the evening crowd. I sat there, staring at the empty seat across from me, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over me. She'd come clean, or at least as clean as she could, and now I was free from her lies, free from the twisted web Matt had spun. I paid for my coffee and left, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting from my shoulders. It was time to let go, to leave them both behind. I walked home in silence, ready to start fresh, ready to build a new life without the ghosts of betrayal haunting me. The following weeks passed quietly. I poured myself into work, into reconnecting with old friends, and slowly, the remnants of my life with Jenny began to fade. I'd finally closed that chapter, left it in the past where it belonged. I didn't hear from her again, and honestly, I was relieved. She and Matt could deal with whatever fallout remained between them. I wanted no part of it. One evening, just as I was beginning to feel like my life had some sense of normalcy again, I received a message from a number I didn't recognize. The text was short, almost cryptic. Ryan, you need to know? It's about Matt. My blood ran cold as I stared at the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message and move on. But curiosity, that same pull that had driven me to uncover the truth in the first place, wouldn't let me leave it alone. Reluctantly, I replied, asking who it was. The response came quickly. This is Alyssa, Matt's ex-wife. I sat there stunned. I knew Matt had been married before, but Jenny had only mentioned it briefly, claiming he'd divorced years ago. But why was his ex-wife reaching out to me now? Can we meet? She texted. I think you need to hear what I have to say. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I couldn't help but feel that there was a missing piece to the story, something that had slipped through the cracks of everything I'd been told. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe downtown the next day. The next afternoon, I arrived early, sitting in a corner booth with a view of the entrance. I didn't know what to expect, but a part of me was bracing for yet another bombshell. A few minutes later, a woman with dark hair and sharp eyes walked in, scanning the room until her gaze landed on me. She approached, offering a polite nod before taking a seat across from me. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I know this is probably the last thing you want to be dealing with, but I thought you should know about Matt." I leaned back, folding my arms. "What exactly do I need to know?" She hesitated, glancing down at her hands before finally meeting my gaze. "I don't know how much you know about his past, but Matt, he has a history. This thing with Jenny? It's not the first time he's done something like this." "I figured as much," I replied, my voice cold. "But why reach out to me now? What's changed?" She took a deep breath, looking almost haunted. "Because he's still doing it. After me, there were other women, married women, vulnerable women he could manipulate. He thrives on it. I tried to warn people before, but he's good at covering his tracks. I thought maybe if someone else knew, someone who's been through it, they'd help put an end to it." My stomach twisted as her words sank in. I remembered the way Jenny had looked when she tried to explain, the guilt in her eyes as she told me Matt had manipulated her. I hadn't wanted to believe it then, but now, maybe there had been some truth in her words. "So you're saying he's been doing this for years?" I asked, struggling to keep the anger out of my voice. She nodded. "Years. I watched him tear apart marriages, destroy families, and walk away like nothing happened. He's a master manipulator, Ryan. I was married to him. I saw the damage he's capable of firsthand." A dark realization settled over me. I'd spent months hating Jenny, feeling like she was solely to blame, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that Matt had orchestrated more of this than I'd thought. I'd always seen her affair as her betrayal, but maybe she'd been a pawn in Matt's twisted game, manipulated and used like so many others. Alyssa leaned forward, her eyes intense. "If you're willing, I think we could do something about it. We could expose him, let his victims know they're not alone. Maybe then he'll finally have to face the consequences of what he's done." I hesitated, a mixture of anger and a strange, reluctant relief washing over me. I'd been left in ruins because of him, because of the lies he'd spun and the lives he'd torn apart. And now, here was a chance to stop him from doing it to anyone else. "All right," I said, my voice steady. "I'm in. Let's put an end to this." Over the next few days, Alyssa and I gathered every scrap of information we could find on Matt, emails, photos, anything that painted a clear picture of his manipulation and deceit. She reached out to some of his previous victims, women who'd been left heartbroken and humiliated. With each story, the evidence piled up, painting a dark portrait of the man who had destroyed so many lives without a second thought. Finally, we compiled everything into a single document, a comprehensive account of Matt's history of manipulation, betrayal, and emotional abuse. Alyssa sent it to a contact in the local media, an investigative reporter who had a reputation for exposing hidden scandals. Within days, the story broke. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Matt's reputation crumbled overnight as the truth spread, as more women came forward with their own stories of betrayal. He tried to deny it, of course, tried to paint himself as the victim, but the evidence was overwhelming. His friends turned on him, his colleagues distanced themselves, and his social life became a ghost town. It was a small victory, but it felt like justice, a justice that had been a long time coming. In the weeks that followed, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time since this nightmare had started, I felt truly free. I wasn't just moving on from Jenny. I was moving on from everything Matt had taken from me. His betrayal, his lies, they no longer had a hold over me. I'd exposed him, let the world see him for who he truly was, and now, I could finally let go. One evening, as I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I'd walked through the fire, survived the betrayal, and come out the other side stronger. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it. And as I looked out at the world before me, I knew that I was finally free, free to live, to love, and to rebuild without the shadows of the past haunting me. This was my life, my story, and it was only just beginning. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.